So Isabelle joined us, I think, 2 years ago, right? Yeah. Now. He's a social scientist and was trained in urban environmental planning. She had her PhD in Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and she was also trained in international development in France. And her research is situated at the intersection of urban planning and policy, social inequality, and development study. Looks at urban dimension of environmental justice, and more specifically, community struggle for just and livable city in the US, Europe, and I think also Latin America, right? She just finished a book, so congratulations. It's a hard work. Neighborhood as Refugee. Environmental Justice and Community Reconstruction in Boston, Havana, and Barcelona. Will be published with Mid Press. And she also started a new project on environmental gentrification conflict that is community mobilization against a neighborhood greening project that lead to land encroachment and displacement in Boston and Medellin. Okay, thanks to be here with us, so I give you the floor.
I'm not at all used to giving a lecture with a microphone. Whoops. So I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me okay, or do I need to speak louder? Okay. All right. So thanks, Giacomo, for this introduction. So yeah, as Giacomo told you, I do a lot of urban research, and I know most of you do more rural research. So I'll try to give examples that are more based also on your research, but maybe I can convince a few of you that there are a lot of similarities between conflicts and struggles in urban space and rural areas. So we'll try to have something more interactive and as parallel as possible. My goal also for today is that you guys can ask questions during the presentation, maybe not 20 during the first slide, but I'll try to encourage you to also ask, if you have doubts, concerns, if you want to reflect on your own research, because that's also the goal of a session like today. In terms of the focus, so the first focus of today is on interviews, and maybe it's time for me to do that. Yeah. So the focus of today is on interviews, but basically I also want to start very briefly on the principles and goals of qualitative research. Because that's basically what we are introducing you to or strengthening your skills in during the week. We're not touching surveys, we're not touching GIS, we're not touching methods that require a systematic type of analysis, that requires statistical analysis and models. So before I jump into interview, I'll have just a brief presentation of the purpose of qualitative research. Then we'll talk about the interviews themselves, the process of preparing interviews. We'll spend quite a lot of time on that. Then we'll have the break, I think, or just before. We'll see how it works. Then we'll talk about field notes, which is an integral part of the interview process and also takes place after the interview process. Then analysis of interviews. I also have a quick presentation of a software that some of you might have used before or that some of you might want to use in the future that serves to analyze qualitative data, which is NVivo. And then I'll wrap it up with a case in point, with an example of research I've conducted, not because it's great research, but it's because that's the research that I know the best. And then in the afternoon, we'll have some group work. Okay, so the purpose of qualitative research. According to you, why do we conduct qualitative research? Sorry. Why qualitative research? In which purpose? What are you trying to
understand things that are not numerable, that cannot be reduced to numbers or graphs or schemes. So when we deal with meanings, ideas, and abstract themes. that are not easy to grasp through numbers.
Yes. Okay. So that's a very good explanation. You're trying to understand meaning, and that I think is very important, because when you do qualitative research, the goal for you is really the deep understanding, what the German called Verstehen, of meanings, of behaviors and action. And you really try to get immersed in something, and you really try to build an argument. And that's something that is very important, because when I work with students and I see, they conduct a lot of interviews, and then they try to put it together in themes, and they have a lot of different themes that are the themes of their interviews, basically, and they try to find patterns. But there is not always an argument, some sort of thread that goes through their analysis. And I think that's very important. That what is the story that you're trying to build here when you conduct interviews? What is the main argument? What is the main pattern that you have found through your interviews? And the reason also you study qualitative research, while you use qualitative research, is because you're really trying to understand tensions, conflicts, processes, change, contradictions. And that is not something that you can do through a survey, for instance. And I insist about the fact that surveys is quantitative research, even though you use words, even though you have questions that sometimes are very, very close to a structured interview. You cannot find the same types of tensions. You cannot bring out the same type of conflicts in a personality, in an event, in a group of people, as you can do that in qualitative research. And so, of course, there are trade-offs, qualitative and quantitative research. Qualitative research will have more depth, will have less generalizability, but will be more rich and will be more embedded in the events, in the actions of people. And it will be more abstract as well. You will be able to generalize processes, understandings, and metaphors from people's words that you will then be able to aggregate, as I was saying before, into an argument that you will weave into the results section, for instance, of a paper. And what's important here is that it's not because you describe or you interview people that actually what you are writing about is about people. You are actually not looking for information. You are really looking for deep processes of what is happening, for instance, in an organization. So, for instance, if you interview public servants in the city of Barcelona about urban sustainability program, you are not really interviewing the people and looking for information about, necessarily what is the number of community gardens that have been financed over the last year, or what is the policy of this particular office in regards to solar panels on buildings. It is really about the behavior of organization, the routine behaviors of civil servants, the types of conflicts that can emerge between different offices. For instance, the Office of Sustainability versus the Office of Economic Development, for instance. So it's not really about the people themselves, it's really about the stories behind what they do and where they work or what they have been acting around, like a conflict or something. So this is more the general gist of what I would like to keep in mind for you to also think about as you keep doing your research. And I could see from your posters that a lot of you are doing qualitative research, are planning to do a lot of interviews. So that's something for you to really think about. What is my research question? And I think Georgos will talk more about that on Wednesday. But what is really bringing me to do this interview? What is the purpose behind my research, and what is this interview helping me towards that, then I can answer my research question. Okay, so as you know, there are several methods for qualitative research, and today we're talking about interviewing. Later this week, there will be some other techniques, but again, I could see from your posters that interviewing seems to be a really core technique that many of you will use, so we'll spend a lot of time on that today. Preparing and conducting interviews. Sí, ya. Me estoy dando cuenta de que hay los dos. Okay. So, just briefly again, why are we conducting interviews? We want to have very detailed and very holistic descriptions of different types of processes, of different actions, of events. For instance, people going to a protest against gold mining in Peru, people organizing a campaign against a certain type of soybean plantation, etc. And we try to integrate multiple perspectives. And that's very important because I think that many of you, many of us, are interested in the activists themselves. That's why we do political ecology. But many times we also forget that to really understand the behavior of activists, we also need to interview the people around them that actually are opposed to the activists themselves. So, you know, get at an oil company, get at a developer who wants to have a mall in the middle of a big urban farm in the outskirts of Los Angeles, for instance. Interviewing city officials, interviewing public policymakers in the Andes or whatever, and that's very important. We want to describe processes, we want to see how people interpret the events in which they are, and we also want to really bring people's subjectivities together. So you will contrast different responses from different interviewees. And that's what's really neat, because sometimes you will have people who have nothing to do with each other, but sometimes you will have, you know, a group of people who have organized a protest, for instance, and you want to really understand why they've come to work on that together, what everyone is bringing together to these protests, with which values they come, which type of principles motivate their action, which type of goals motivate their action. And that's how interviews will bring you that type of information. And because of the way interviews are analyzed, at the end, this is how you can develop a hypothesis. You can develop this argument that I've talked about, but you can also conduct mixed methods thanks to it. And you know, you can build a hypothesis that then you can test through a survey, for instance. And that's done a lot, and I think some of you are also planning to do that. So qualitative research and interviews are the basis for quantitative research. So that's two different things. In qualitative research per se, and then qualitative research / interviews are the base for quantitative research. Raise your hand, those of you who have worked with interviews before. All right, okay. Who has worked a lot with interviews? Who considers that they have worked a lot with interviews? Okay, I mean, not just like 2 or 3 times, but, okay. All right, so I think that's a decent one. So I'm not going to spend too much time on the types of interviews so that we can then move on to some more specifics. So as you know, I imagine, I hope, there are 3 types of interviews. There are the more structured types of interviews that are very, very close to surveys that have the same types of questions that you repeat to each respondent, that generally are more easy to analyze because you can follow precisely the set of questions in general. They are also easy for other people to administer, and that I think that's very important when you start building a bigger project. Sometimes you cannot do the research yourself. You have to have research teams, research assistants, and I think that's important to recognize the power of structured interviews for that reason, because there is not too much leeway for a mistake here, and there's little room for surprises. So even though structured interviews might give you less rich information and might let you delve less into some parallel topics, they are easier to conduct in teams. Then we have the semi-structured interviews, which are, I imagine, the ones that you have conducted the most. Every time I forget, sorry. I don't have the screen of the computer, so I'm reading my thing. So then you have the semi-structured interview, which are the ones that I think we tend to conduct the most. They are more fluid, they are more flexible. You can change a little bit the order of questions. You can add questions here and there depending on the respondent. However, the risk there is that if you go too far away from the framework that you had, from the list of questions you had, you can't analyze them as much, because one respondent, you will have asked him about transportation planning in some parts of Catalonia, and someone else who will have asked him about the relationship of that to energy consumption, for instance. So it might be a little bit more difficult to compare interviews with each other, but that's also where, in a way, you build this little puzzle towards an argument. And they also require a lot of practice, and I think that's also why we have these questions, because many of us have worked with interviews, but unless we really practice a lot, we actually do not exactly know what we can expect. And as you know, interviews, you can't screw up an interview, because if you have an interview with the head of the health department in a city, for instance, you're not going to have a second chance to go back and say, I'm sorry, I forgot 5 questions, can we have an interview? Again, it's going to be a little bit more tricky. So they really require a lot of practice and having a really neat guide for interviews. And then you have the conversational interviews. And I think those are also extremely important because, especially for us who tend to study conflicts and issues that tend to be more sensitive and delicate, they really help you build a relationship of trust with the person who you are interviewing. And that's important because sometimes a semi-structured interview where you'll sit together at a table, you'll have your guide, you'll have your notes, you'll have your recorder, that might impress someone a little bit too much. So with a conversational interview that you might have on a public square, that's very close to, in a way, an informal discussion. You might have a lot of rich information without necessarily having to create a little bit of scare from the person who is in front of you. The problem is that they might be more difficult to analyze because you cannot talk. You cannot take notes as you go through the interview, and you have to quickly sit down after the interview to actually remember everything you've heard. But I think ideally you might combine the 3 types of interviews, and I'm sure many of you do that. Now, the respondents. It's not the same to interview, as you know, as to survey. And so the goal here, and the way that you describe that in research papers, is to really think about how do you sample in a way that is not statistical samplings. Or, we're not doing here stratified sampling. We are trying in general to have key informants and to do something that's called snowball sampling. And how do you find informants is always something that creates a lot of anxiety, because you're like, oh my God, I don't have the contacts, how am I going to get to this new field work I have? But, knowing the context beforehand, making your search on internet, reading a lot of stories, oftentimes actually of newspaper articles about a particular setting, about a particular conflict that you are studying, helps you identify some players, and then you can easily Google them or try to call the organization where they are to find those key players. So you can also do some pilot research, meaning you go to a site and you start kind of scoping out the situation a little bit. You go to some public meetings, you try to meet with some of the nonprofits, you try to understand which ones are the stakeholders there. You ask your colleagues. And it's important also to identify the gatekeepers, because I think that, again, because of the type of research we tend to conduct, sometimes we don't realize that there might be actually a whole subset of respondents that we need, but we don't have access to them because the issue is so sensitive, or because they are so closed, or because there are so many researchers that have come here that in the end, people are not opening up to you, and you don't know, actually, that you don't even know that they exist. And that's, I think, was very scary when you arrive to the end of your research project and you're like, oh shoot, maybe I have forgotten a whole type of stakeholders that I haven't identified. I won't spend much time on recruitment. I think what's just very important is to set up a plan before you go to the field. If you travel somewhere that's not the city where you live, try to contact people two weeks in advance, I would say in general, is good for people who are not in public official positions, because this way they can organize a bit their schedule for you. For public officials, for me, it has taken me much more time, because you have to go through different level of assistance in order to get to an interview. So I think that being organized is important. And actually, sometimes it's actually more difficult to organize yourself once you live somewhere. Say you study in Rome and you want to have an interview, you want to do field work there and you work there for a year. Sometimes it's much more difficult to do that because you think you have a lot of time in front of you and you are not immersed in the field. And I think that's what's really valuable about going somewhere, or at least thinking, okay, these months I'm just focusing on my data gathering, because you are really focused, immersed, you are just like going to be very concentrated on the data collection and the data analysis. So think about these different variables, be persistent, and also be sensitive about the way you present the research. You don't need to go into huge detail about who you are and what you are working on, but give people some level of information. But again, you don't need to be just telling them your whole research question, and your theory behind it. Just be respectful, give enough information, but don't overwhelm them either. And for the number of respondents, of course, you need to cover the range, and after a while, when you ask someone at the end of an interview, do you know who else I might need to get in touch with? Who would you recommend I talk to? And if people start telling you names that you have already interviewed, then you are more or less done, I would say. Okay. Do you have any questions on these first few slides? Or any reflections? So then we're going to move into the process itself of interviewing. So the preparation of the fieldwork and the identification of people. Or is everything clear? Yes?
Sometimes happens, Sometimes happens that you have, let's say, a sample of respondents, and after a certain number, you get the same responses.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, if you have 10 people, you have some new idea. If you have 15 people, the 5 extra people don't give you something new. They comment on the same things.
Yeah.
What do you think is the ideal of identifying what's exactly the sample sometimes in this question? I don't know, I know it's more complicated, but as a general guide, I would say.
I mean, I think it also depends on the depth of the initial interviews. I usually go with maybe 10, 15, 20 interview per specific, conflict I'm studying. So for instance, when I did my last fieldwork that was in Boston, and I was studying a conflict between some neighborhood activists and organizations that were fighting the transformation of their neighborhood into a very fancy, gentrified neighborhood with very healthy and organic food stores and parks, but for gentrifiers. And they were saying, no, this is a Latino neighborhood. We don't want to be invaded by, yuppies who are going to come and going to encroach our space, which is this concept of environmental gentrification I'm talking about. We want to be green for us, but not for the others. So I interviewed maybe 7 or 8 of the core activists, that are really the ones who organized the protests, who were at public meetings, who were really immersed in the day-to-day social networking online. So that was, 8 or 9 people. I interviewed some of the supporters around there. So some of the universities, there were some media that were around them. There were some national level organizations. So that gave me, 5, 6 extra interviews, so that was the other stakeholders. Then I interviewed some of the people against them, which were in general the ones who wanted to put the project in. So I interviewed the big chain, the huge corporation that wanted to go into the neighborhood. I interviewed some of the city officials behind the project as well. So that easily gives you 20 people. But I would say among the core activists, if you think about them, probably, 8 to 10 people would be a good number if you can have rich information. What have you guys found in general about your own process of interviewing and selecting respondents? Yeah. Vale. Yeah.
I think it's really a quite problem to find the right size of the sample and the right composition of the sample. Because if you compare qualitative research with quantitative research, for instance in economics, you don't have this kind of problem. when you do econometrics, you know that you have to have 10 people, 10 individuals in your sample per modality of variable. This is how your sample is made, and you know that if you have that, then you have a sample that is suitable for your research.
Yeah.
This is a problem for us doing qualitative research because we don't know how much people in advance we have to interview. And we don't know, there's another problem, we don't know the structure of the sample. For instance, this get back to another problem is what are you trying to observe? And the variable that you are trying to assess, for instance, the type of factors, maybe sometimes you have just one actor, and speaking, for instance, is representative only is speaking. If you get to interview, I don't know, Generalitat de Catalunya on a subject, there's only one actor you can assess. Or you can see everybody within Generalitat de Catalunya to have the speaking of only Generalitat de Catalunya. This is one actor. So the question is how you categorize actors. I'm not speaking properly, but how you categorize actor in relation to your variable that you're trying to assess. Yeah. It's really a problem. I have never solved it and never seen anybody solving this problem.
And sometimes you don't even know the variables until you're really halfway or 3/4 of the way within your field work. That's very true. Irina, you wanted to say something?
I was having the same problem in Roșia Montana when I was doing research, because at some point, because of my questions, and because of the fact that the people I was interviewing were already so used to so many journalists who have been researching them for so long, and they had the responses like prepared most of the time. Yeah, yeah. And I realized, you know what, I need to change a little bit my questions. Because if I was asking the things that I kind of already knew, that, you know, the responses, so I had to adjust my interview guide a lot in order to get different information, let's say, because I wanted to see what people from the community think, not just what the people transformed in activists began to think. So when I started listening more in the piazza, talking to themselves, I found out very interesting, intimate, personal stories that I would have never had in an interview. So then after listening to many conversations, I start having more unstructured interviews and more conversational interviews. And then I combined the two. You know, I combined an interview guide, an adjusted interview guide, just to get different information, more in depth about their ideologies, their ideas, their philosophies, their imagination, projections, and things like that. Because otherwise I would only answer like for journalists. That's what they were used to give, the journalist kind of response for the journalists. So that was my experience.
You make a very important point in terms of the differentiation between the researcher and the journalist. And I think that many of us who tend to do research that are in areas that are very visible, that have been very much reported upon, for which there's a lot already of data having been collected, we really need to be very careful about the relationship that we have to this community, to this place, and also that we are not journalists. And speaking of that, so that's actually a good segue to something I wanted to show you. Maybe it's here. Where is it? What is co-extraíble? Vale. how many of you use informed consent forms? Can you raise your fingers if you do? That's very little. And I think that this is something that is very European, I have to say. And I'm European myself, but that's very different from the North American context because I think there is a lot of, there has been so much abuse in the natural science research that there has been a lot of counterback protection of the subjects that were being part of lab research. And so now in each university, whether you are a student or professor, you need to go through a board that's an ethical board for research. And I think that it's very cumbersome, it's a pain in the butt, but actually it's very important to protect you as a researcher, to protect the person. And so since I've been here, I've actually gone through the same process because I think that actually this is really where you are different as a researcher from a journalist, because you build a relationship that's also based on ethics and of responsibility. And I'm not saying that journalists are not responsible, but you also engage your own professional morale behind that. Now, this is a very simple form, and I'm happy to share it with you, that I've just been, that was based on the one I used to write when I was doing research in the US. That's called a consent form. So consent to participate in an interview. You have a line that's very simple about your research project, my title. I was doing interviews in Spanish and in English, so I had something about in which language the script was to be done. And then here, the first paragraph is actually, and I adjusted it here because I'm also doing research here now, about what is my study about. So you have been asked to participate in a research study conducted by blah, blah, blah in Barcelona. The purpose of it is to better understand the dynamics and processes for neighborhood improvements and environmental revitalization in fragile and diverse areas of the cities. What I want to say here in this more or less jargon high sentence is that I'm trying to study conflicts. But you see, I'm not bringing it too much in the form because people are scared when you tell them the word conflict. And then I said, you are selected as a possible participant in this study because of your particular knowledge of experience in livability issues and community strengthening. That's a way to say community organization or resistance. You should understand well the information below and ask questions about anything you do not understand before deciding whether or not to participate. And then there are some points that are very standard. This interview is voluntary, you will not be compensated for it, and unless you give us permission to use your name, title, and quote in any publication that might result from this research, the information you tell us will be confidential. Then you ask for the permission to use a recorder, you tell them by when the project will be completed, and you give them a few years ahead because research always takes longer. And then here, you also ask them, do you understand the procedures described above? Have your questions been answered to your satisfaction? And do you agree to participate in the study? So sometimes you can read the script depending on the language. Sometimes you make them read the script. You leave a copy of the form with them. And then here, they can check things to which they give permission. Obviously, they give permission to the interview. But here it's more about, I give permission for this interview to be recorded on the tape. I give permission for the following information to be included in publications, my name, my title, direct quotes, name of subject, signature of researcher, and then your contact information. And that's very simple, and you bring them with you to the interview at the beginning, and I think that sets up a certain relationship of trust and of really putting you in a different shoe than a journalist or than just someone who is curious.
I just have two comments. First of all, when I was kind of forced by the US university where I was to use this kind of consent form, I thought it's more like a formality, and it actually made my fieldwork a little bit more difficult because people were looking at me like I'm some kind of, why do you need my signature? I don't want to talk.
Yeah, that's tricky too.
And it's difficult, it's tricky. You have to be really, to be careful with that. But in the same time, recently I found out that if it wasn't for this consent form, I wouldn't have been able to publish one article recently because they specifically asked, do you have a consent form for your interviews? Otherwise, we don't publish. So it was very important, and I was so happy that I actually had these signatures and this. So just a comment. No, you really want to know? The name of it was Studies in Social Justice. It was not even an ISA journal, but it was from Canada. So I guess certain journals are very specific about, yeah.
So sometimes you don't have to make them sign the form, but at least you record their answer. Yes, I agree to this interview on your recorder. I agree for my tape, for my quotes to be used. I do not want my name, nor my title, nor the one of my organization to appear on the publication, and then that's another form of record. So that's the most formal one. That's more for like the global north. And it's also maybe sometimes more helpful for elite interviews. So a lot of you asked us to have a little bit of a discussion on elite interviewing or marginalized people interviewing. And I think that tends to reassure a lot people in high-level positions, municipal agencies, corporations, etc. Anything else?
No, I'm wondering how you would deal with this when you talk to like members of an indigenous community in the middle of the Amazon who might not be able to write, for example. Yeah, but then again, like, it might be something very, how to say, no. It might scare them in a certain way. And if it's something that is written and they already don't know how to read, and then they put their thumb on something, I mean.
I'm not saying that this is for all the time, and I think that when you are in a context of more isolated people also from a very different culture, that makes sense not to use the form, but either if you are able to record, have it on the recorder, you know, just say, yes, I agree for this interview, and please don't use my name, or at least be very conscious of the issues that might appear if the person's identity is being known in a publication or reported somewhere, I would say at the very, very least. And insist also on the confidentiality aspect at the beginning of the interview. Okay. Yeah.
To me, it happened that I had to present the informed consent ex post the interview, like after the interview, after I had transcribed it. For the need of publication, I need to come back to the person and ask him for...
That happens too.
Yeah, and the fact is that the person wanted to read the transcription, and in the end wanted to change certain things when she learned that this will be published, because she said something against some powerful people, and she didn't want this to appear. So in these cases, like, I feel there is a danger, because you can lose some information that you want to use. But at the same time, you are being very honest.
Yeah, exactly.
But how do you cope with it? Like,
I think that the most important is for you as a researcher to be ethical, because that's our professional responsibility. So I would say that definitely quote what she tells you you are allowed to quote, but you can still describe if she says something, I don't want to be quoted on that, but you know that this is part of a dynamic within her organization, within an event, within something, you can describe that in the background, for instance, without mentioning at all where she comes from. So if there is no way for you to, or if there is no way to really put a name, nor the name of a department, or the name of maybe even an organization, but actually talk about it, I think that's a good middle way to deal with it.
To take the responsibility, instead of let somebody else speaking, me myself describing what the person said and doesn't want to be quoted.
Yes, but really in a way that's much more general than that, so that her name, her organization doesn't show upon that, doesn't appear on it. Yeah. Let's see. I'm here. Vale. No, perdón. Okay. So let's go to the process of interviewing. Well, more or less, we have already talked about all of this, you know, building a social relationship of trust. And it also comes back to what I was saying earlier. Many people think you are looking for problems, like you are looking for bad stuff, and they are really afraid of that. And I think making them comfortable, saying, you know, I'm trying to understand your insights, your perspective, your experience, makes them more comfortable because, again, political ecology involves a lot of controversial events, a lot of controversial developments. So making people feel at ease about who you are and just in general trying to understand their perspective is very helpful. And I remember when I was back in the days doing some interviews with mining companies in Peru, you know, coming really with the name. I'm from this university, I'm a researcher, I'm actually trying to understand also how you feel about these indigenous protests that just destroyed part of your extraction facilities. I think that for them, you know, because you are a researcher, that was more helpful for getting the interview and then developing the interview. Triangulate, I would say, the information as much as possible because we are all come with our own interests, with what we are trying to prove. We have some hypothesis behind our mind when we go in the field, but for you it's also important to say, okay, this is really great what this person has said, but actually I should see if it's really true, first of all, and I should really have the perspective of someone else because otherwise I provide a very biased description of what happened. If you can have pilot interviews to test some of your questions before, that can be very helpful, but it's not as important, I would say, as a pilot survey. And sometimes we don't have this luxury of having pilot interviews. And having the interviews, I think that to have a really rich interview, 45 minutes to 2 hours, an hour and a half interview is really great. But sometimes we don't have that time, and I think that's also very important for you and for all of us to know that in advance and to really have a guide of interview saying, okay, I had 15 or 20 questions. I'm going to write down or highlight the one that I really need to ask to this mayor or to this planner because I know I will only have 15 to 20 or 30 minutes. And do not ask questions that you can find data somewhere else on that, because I think that happens a lot. Sometimes we want to understand the background of something and someone goes on and on and on and on. And then you realize that you don't have time anymore. So prioritize your questions a lot. Did you guys read the article by Leach, the one about the questions? What did you think of it, and how helpful is it for the way that you plan your interviews? You need the microphone? Yeah.
No, like I've I've heard several instructions about interviewing, etc. But I found this paper very spot on because it's so short. So I recommend to anybody to read it. But what was not covered by either of the paper was the interview guide, and I think this is something really important. How do you make an interview guide?
Okay.
For the rest, it was very good.
Okay. So yes, an interview guide. In general, I would say that it's important to ask the sensitive questions. If you think about the structure of an interview guide, it's important to ask the sensitive questions about something maybe halfway through the interview. Not at the beginning, not at the end, because oftentimes your sensitive questions are the ones that you really want to get at. And to keep the more informational questions for the end, because they are the ones that, in the worst case scenario, you can ask, you know, someone's colleagues, or you can find on internet. And in general, I try to ask what Leach called grand tour questions, or more general questions to ease the respondent into the interview at the very beginning of it. So, could you describe a typical day in your job, for instance? Or could you describe a little bit the process of having started this Greenpeace campaign against nuclear energy? Can you describe the process of organizing this demonstration in Barcelona against expropriation or something like that? can you tell me a little bit more about how you came to work on gold mining resistance, if you interview someone from Oxfam, for instance. So these grand tour questions. And then you can get more and more into the more specific aspects. So for instance, what strategies have you been using to counter these new oil pipe in the Amazon? What have been the allies that you have been trying to reach out around? What has motivated the use of this particular tactic, for instance? So you go really from the beginning, from these big grand tour questions, to the more specific ones. Try to use more how and why questions, as you know, even though why questions are very sensitive because people don't always know exactly why they are doing something, you know, or sometimes they don't even reflect on it this particular way. So it's better, instead of asking, why did you go to this protest, for instance, why did you join this demonstration, this strike, rather than saying that, you can ask it in a more indirect way. Could you tell me a little bit the way that, you know, you started becoming interested in the issue of job cuts in Spain, for instance, if you are talking about someone who goes into a demonstration against unemployment in Spain, or if you go to a demonstration against, someone goes to a demonstration against wind power, instead of asking, why have you gone to this demonstration and why have you participated, you can say, you know, when was the first time that you heard about this wind power project in your community? Or can you tell me a little bit about when you first noticed that there would be this project here? How did you become interested in the issue? And like that, you maybe get a little bit at the specifics, but not necessarily a very big why question that someone might be a bit stunned by. For the more sensitive questions, use non-judgmental, non-threatening words. So for instance, if you talk to someone about civil war and death, you don't, or a hurricane, for instance, Hurricane Katrina in the US, you don't say, tell me about the children who died in the hurricane, but how many children are the lost ones, so that it's a little bit more delicate. Avoid what's called double-barrel questions, so be very careful about what will the person focus on, what will the person hear when they hear the question that you ask. For instance, what did you work on last Tuesday, and when did you decide to go to the protest against the power plant? Two different things, but sometimes because we are very much in a hurry to get through the interview and we're really afraid we won't have time, we packed a lot of information in the interview questions. The challenges that we face during the interviews, as I was saying, avoid asking why questions. Most people don't really have accounts about why they do specific things. And you need stories, and I think in anthropology, even though I'm not an anthropologist, I'm more like a sociologist, I think that people want to tell you stories. That's what we are good at, that's what we like to reflect, and actually sometimes you can't pay, or oftentimes you cannot pay your respondents, but at least for them to have a chance to reflect on something with you is actually really helpful and is a way for them to tell their stories. You know, tell me a time about when you did something. Had this ever happened to you? Have you have you ever been to a demonstration? In your neighborhood, what kind of problems bother you? You know, when you're talking about a neighborhood that has a lot of environmental issues. Try to relate situations to each other. Try to create a form of memory that will engage people. Watch very much for silences. It's very difficult to interpret them, but people really show an engagement when they have this silence. They really try to get at something that they want to convey to you, or they might find a particular question puzzling, or they might find a particular question sensitive that brings them to a memory, you know, of sadness, of something very difficult that has happened to them, a mining accident, for instance, an oil spill, whatever that is. Words for jokes too. Jokes are a way to, you know, make them feel at ease as respondents, but also to convey something that might be delicate and that might only be able to be conveyed through jokes. And what's very important, I think, during the interviews is that don't try to force people to be types, because sometimes we have these preconceived ideas of what we're looking for. But actually, everyone has different ways to report to the world. And did you guys do the reading by Weiss about the respondents? You could see that they were, I mean, sometimes the interviewer just like goes on and on and on with things that, you know, is not exactly what the interviewee wants to talk about. But that's not a very good interview in the end, because you have more of a confrontational relationship being built with the respondent rather than a trustful relationship. And that's very important, not to pre-apply what we hope to see in an interview in the interview itself. Okay, so you guys wanted to hear about delicate interviews. So I've put some thoughts together from the beginning a little bit to the end of such an interview. Well, first of all, how to get to elites. Obviously, you use your contacts. And most important, I've noticed through my own work, is that you really have to work with the assistant of the person, because this assistant is a gatekeeper. And oftentimes, through a phone call, you will get much more than an email. And the assistant will ask you very often to send an email about what's your research, where are you from, what are you doing in this research project, because they will want to share these description with the person with whom you are requesting the interview. So be very careful about how you phrase that email. Be very conscious about the time, the space of the interview, what you are requesting, really, like what will be the type of sensitive topics for the interviewee, which is why watch very much how you phrase your work with the assistant of this person. Watch for the etiquette also of the organization. But don't be scared, because you know, you are all very good researchers, otherwise you wouldn't be here today. And so you've been used already to phrasing or rephrasing things in different ways depending on who you talk to. Present yourself very clearly. This is where I mentioned earlier the importance of confidentiality, informed consent. This is the way that you protect yourself and you protect the person. And actually, what I found in elite interviewing is that even though we are really scared at first, because of this relationship of trust, they can actually come out of their role quite easily in the end, especially because you are a researcher and not a journalist. And you might find that you have a quite personable relationship with the person by the end, even though you don't agree with the person, even though they might say something shocking, but they might actually, you know, be willing to open up to you. And that's something also that is very powerful in an interview. Very important, make sure you do your homework beforehand. That is, know about the person, his or her biography, what he has done or she has done before. What have been the public statements they have made recently? What have been the position that they have taken on a particular conflict? Has this position evolved over time? For instance, were they always in favor of a new site for a gas extraction? Or have they just taken favorable position towards it? What does that mean? Have they gotten some bribe in between? Or has there been a new law that has made them be more willing to have this new oil company or gas company come in? Do not ask questions you can find answers to online or in reports. That seems easy, but I think sometimes we do that because we still want to have a confirmation, but I think that's, you know, that actually might show to the person that you have not done what they would expect from a researcher to do. Have a few key priority list of questions among the precise interview guide you will have, because again, you don't know. You might get interrupted by a phone call where someone said, okay, sorry, I need to step out, we're done. I know I told you you had 40 minutes, but we actually had 15 minutes. So you might have one more last question to ask, and you really need to prioritize. And something that might impress them is try to find or use as stepping tool for the questions, information that you have found in reports, in newspapers, online, because I think that's a way for them to really see that, okay, you have made a conscious effort of looking for some precise information that will lead you to the interview, and this way they will be quite impressed. Okay, before jumping to that, do you guys have any questions on elites? Any concerns? or remarks.
I only want to point out that this last point, I do think it's one, at least from my experience, is one of the points that works better. Using external information in order to be able to open doors. It's very easy because sometimes the elites do also use a lot of this information in the day-by-day work. So for them, any reference to an article or to a database or whatever of this kind of stuff is like saying, okay, yes, you are in the right, you can speak on the same language because it's the usual language. So this is quite, at least from my experience, it works very well. So I think it's important.
And I like the fact that you said you speak the same language. You don't necessarily speak the language of the activists. You speak their own language. You put yourself in their world. Any other concerns or remark you want to share, experience? Don't be shy. Don't be scared. Jorgos told me that you had questions about that, so. Go ahead.
Less a question, more a comment. I think
Go
also
ahead.
timing of the interviews fairly important, especially with elites. For example, I'm doing research on plantations, and if I were to ask an investor or their farm manager for an interview before I interviewed the laborers, my subsequent research can really get meddled with because they try to avoid that I ask certain people certain questions. So I think it is really important, for example, to consider maybe I'll ask them questions after I've asked other actors. Yeah.
No, that's extremely important point. Very, very valuable point. When does the timing of the elite come within your whole field work? At the beginning, you don't have all of the information you might need to really delve into some special issues with them. So that's actually really important. And also the question is, people will know in general when you are in the middle of the conflict asking questions, other people will know who you have interviewed, or they might find out. And so the question is also to again and again present yourself as a researcher, even though you all have we all have an activist mind behind, because then how do you appear vis-a-vis the farmers or vis-a-vis the more marginalized people that you have talked to the landowner? And that's when you have to step in back in your identity of researcher and say, I actually need to have a whole picture, or I needed to find out something that I couldn't otherwise. So always being able to reflect also on who knows and who will find out who you have interviewed.
What happens? Are you honest about who you are and your how you feel about the conflict? I mean, if it's an elite, if it's a head of a mining company, do you go there? I'm researching mining, or are you very honest about what you feel about the project? I mean, sometimes I find it's more. Maybe it's better just to not give too much information about, you give information that you're from a university, but not about how you feel about what they do, so they give more information, or is that not very ethical?
No, I think that's a good middle way, because obviously, first of all, if you say you are studying political ecology, or you are in a school that's called Institute of Environmental Science and Technology, as soon as you say the word environment, they will know that you are not in the engineering. Like if you were systems engineering division or something, you might be less obvious. But I generally don't go into too much detail about where my positions are, because I want to, the goal of the research is to also try to have everyone's perspective, at least in terms of the stakeholders. So I do more or less what you said. I explain where I come from, what is the issues I'm studying, and that I'm interested in actually also. I think when people realize that also what you're trying to do is have their own experience, insights, they actually will open up, because they say, okay, actually, she's not just trying to say that all mining companies are bad and that oil companies are just going to destroy the Amazon. She's going to come there to also have our own perspective. So I would think that it's actually quite valuable to be careful how you present yourself, but say a few words.
I would say maybe start with, let's say, the bad guys. And the ones that will have more problems, we're going to have more hard time to have the interview. Maybe we have to come first, let's say, if we're going to, I'm talking about conflicts, but if he's going to have an occupation, for example, it's better to interview the farmer before, because after maybe, if you are going to follow, we are going together with the occupation, because after he'll probably not going to trust us, even though we can explain everything and etc. He may be closer. Maybe it's easier when we have the elite would be closer. They did before to start with those the toughest interview, and then go to the other ones that we can reflect and have more time. I don't know if I usually do that working in the Amazon. Otherwise, I would never get an interview with a logger or with a farmer if I go after the conflict is open.
Conscious about the fact that you might need to know someone's perspective or a particular event that happened to a farmer, for instance, a particular accident or a particular protest that you didn't know before you went to talk to the company. So there are trade-offs. I know I'm not wetting myself.
When I arrived in Rocha, Montana, this place was a small place. Everybody knows everybody. And if I wanted to go talk to the corporation, I would have no chance to talk with the people after that. Actually, even when I first arrived, I had to wear this T-shirt saying "Save Rocha, Montana" because otherwise many people. So what are you doing here? Are you sure you are with us? So it was such a pressure to make a statement about your position from the beginning that it was impossible for me to talk to anybody from the corporation. And in the end, I had to give up that, and I'm still thinking whether I should be doing something like that in my future research, or I should just focus on, because the corporation is very transparent about everything when it comes to their discourse on their websites. Everything they have so much money to produce materials to express their opinions in everywhere, media, mass media, written, printed, everything. And I'm like, why do I need to interview these elites since they have so much power to express their why do I need to go to elites? That's like one question.
We can't think about a big corporation as a monolithic block, and I have found, again, that's more like when I was, a few years ago when I did research in Peru about copper mining, what I found is that, yes, as you say, they are like the big guys, the headquarters, the one from whom information is published on the website, marketing, etc. But then you also have the field officers, the one that have a much smaller office, a much closer communication also with the people on the ground in the middle of an Andean community. And I have found that with them, it's actually quite enriching to talk and to have information beforehand from the community that I can try to ask them questions about. So I would say that maybe if I have to interview people from the headquarters, I would maybe start with them. But then once I am in a community in the field, I think that I would actually wait for community activists to have told me a little bit to reach the other ones, because I also feel that it's a little bit less difficult to interview them than the people in the headquarters. And they have sometimes a very different perspective because they live the conflict every day. They represent the corporation, but they live the conflict every day too. So that's my kind of response. Okay. All right, so let's move to the, very similar in a way, the hostile respondents, who sometimes can be elites and who sometimes are not elites. Here, as I've said before, I think it's very important to position yourself as a researcher, not a practitioner and an activist. And maybe Giacomo disagrees with me, I don't know. But he and Claudio will be able to talk to you more about the activist perspective when you are really embedded, when you do participant observation. I'm talking here more about the field work that's more limited in time, that's more bounded, that you don't in which you don't necessarily have such a thick, close, and long-term relationship with the respondents. I think that with hostile respondents, you need to make as everything, like, you know, it's like a psychology session. You need to make the person feel valuable. You need to make the people feel that their role is important for you, that their work is valuable in a certain way. And also, you need to come with a very fresh perspective, even though we all, again, have, first of all, the research questions in our mind, but also our own ethical or political positionings on something. It's important here to be open. Do not come necessarily with what you want to hear, with the preconceived answers, because that's actually also what the research will enrich you if you are really able to take a more, you know, more distant perspective with your own research. Follow their lead, as you could see in the interview, Learning from Strangers, in the book that, or in the chapter that you had to read. Follow their lead, don't impose your lead. Ask them to tell you specific stories, specific accounts. People, as I was saying earlier, they love to talk about stories. They love to talk about what they've had to do about decisions, and that will be a way for them to feel more engaged. Be respectful of their time. And I have found that that's what's very helpful with hostile respondents is to do an interview generally with people, if it's in an organization, with people just under them or people who work with them as collaborators, because they will be able to almost like triangulate some information for you, but also they will be able to give you a little bit more maybe of a genuine perspective or try to help you understand why was this person, you know, not willing for so long to give me an interview, or why did they avoid 5 of the questions that I asked? What's particularly sensitive? And sometimes it doesn't have anything to do with the conflict you are studying, but maybe with the dynamics within an organization. And that's also where you can really build thick layers of understanding, of analysis for you, because you will really be able to understand the inner relationship, the inner intricacies behind an organization's decisions or positioning. So that's for delicate interviews. Oh, go ahead.
You maybe explain your understanding of triangulation, because there are so many different interpretations of what it means.
Triangulation, what I meant by that is, for instance, if someone tells you, if a hostile respondent, say again, we'll go back to this example of the mining company. If the mining company tells you, for the past 5 years, we've been using a type of chemical within the tailings dam that is not supposed to affect the crops of the farmers, that makes the water in the streams nearby still drinkable by the animals, so that's not supposed to affect the health of the cattle. You need to find a way to find out whether that's true, either by having access to data about sampling of the water or by having health reports or talking to some doctors. So I mean triangulation about the veracity, the truth of some information. That's what I mean by that. Yes?
I can read the same slide with friendly respondents. And it is more or less the same, because I think it has more to do with delicate interviews than anything else. For example, sometimes when we do interviews with leaders of any social movement or grassroots movement, it's also very useful to do a second interview with someone working with or around or whatever. And more or less you can see that the same points should be taken in mind with friendly respondents. Because at the end of the day, it's the same time of things. It's about organizations, embedded power, and all this kind of stuff. So it does not matter so much if they are friendly or they are
Well, actually,
hostile.
I think friendly sometimes is more difficult, because you don't know anymore what is the role of the person, who are you as a researcher. So actually, you're right, maybe I should have added also a slide, either a slash next to hostile, or added something else about friendly respondents, because then you really might end up having the same type of trouble. Like, you have such a good conversation with the person that you try to, actually you have a conversation. I just said something I shouldn't have said. You end up having a conversation rather than an interview. And so the time that you speak is almost as long as the time that they speak. And so in the end, you have stepped maybe a little bit too much out of your role as an interviewee. Marta?
What happens if you have this information and you know what they're telling you, an elite person or a delicate interview? you know that what they're telling you is not true, do you actually confront them and tell them? Because sometimes I find it's not useful to say, yeah, I know that what you're saying, this water is actually contaminated, and what you're saying is not true. So do you actually tell them, or to try and extract more information? Or sometimes you just know you're not going to convince them, so you just say, okay, thank you, and move on to the next.
I think I'll wait. I confront a little bit, and I do it more at the end, when I have been sure that I've gone through my whole guide of interviews, and then I said, I have read some reports. Like, I try to make it as scientific as possible, and said, oh, I have read some reports or some statistics that say that actually the contaminants in this water were above the permitted levels. I was wondering what you have to say about this. So I don't necessarily say you are lying, I'm just saying, what do you have to say about that? Just to see in the most possible neutral way, even though you're not that neutral in the end, what they have to report about it, or what their public statement about this. But that's a good question too. So, hostile respondents, and then the last type of category, even though I should add the one on friendly respondents, is marginalized people respondent. And yes, actually, maybe I could use some of this for the hostile respondents too, understanding someone's time, organization, and location limitations as possible. And I think that's very important. I have found, especially for instance in Boston, when I was interviewing a lot of African-American residents in some of the poorest neighborhoods of Boston, I had to reschedule the interview so many times because people didn't have a stable job. So they had to, they were called last minute to go and work an extra shift or something. So I really had to be careful about the fact that I needed to leave enough weeks of field work to finish my research, because with the amount of rescheduling that might happen, I might not have had the chance to talk to the person. And the people are really afraid of you in a different way than the elite interviewing. They don't know what's going to be done with this information, and they are also very careful about sometimes telling you yes to an interview, because first of all, they have a role in the community, either as leader or just as a neighbor or as a friend or a relative, but they also know that they are in a very fragile economic position and that they might lose their job. And that's very different. So for this reason, it's important to offer them a comfortable and safe place to meet. And even though you can't pay them, again, as I was saying before, you can offer them to have a coffee or a piece of cake somewhere, a tea, and then being more comfortable with, they will just be, feeling more relaxed about it. On the other hand, they might actually not want to be seen at all in public, and that's maybe one of the few times that I would say, yes, go to someone's house, sit on their porch with them, and talk to them, even though many books tell you, do not go to people's houses. I think that sometimes you have to do that. Be wary of delicate and personal questions, and emphasize the importance of confidentiality for your work.
Sorry, why did you not go to people's houses?
Well, maybe it's, again, part of my training in the US. It's because it's someone's private space, and so first of all, to protect yourself as a researcher, you are sometimes, you need to be careful about where you go. If you go, if you're in a very, very conflictuous position, you don't know what might happen with you if you go to someone's house versus if you go to a park or to a cafe. And also maybe in general, you step more out of your role as a researcher. I was not as careful as I was, told to be. I mean, I went to their house if they invited me, especially in the global south. I think that's what people tend to do. They see it as something very important to be able to show you their house, and that's actually part of the ritual of the interview. So you have to see what is the context, how well you know the community too, before doing that. Yes, Irina?
For my interviews, actually, that venue for interview was very useful, because they were in a context where everybody was telling them that they are poor, being in their little farm, and they always try to express. You see, we have our land, we have our cattle, so that that venue was very important for them to. It was their story. That was their story, their house, their property, their cattle. That was part of their story. So if they would not give interview out somewhere else, most of them actually. So
I think that's a very good point. Yeah, that it's also part of people's identity to show you where they are.
No, about the place we're interviewing. I also had a very good experience in having walking interviews, like walking through the places I was asking about to the person. Especially, I'm dealing also with the contamination in countryside, near the town where this person inhabit. So the kind of being able to show me, indicate the places he's talking about, and then reflect upon it. And going several places, it's really expand the possibility of things that can come out.
Absolutely, and people feel less formal also. So
they feel they have also the
control.
Yes, because it's like they are becoming a guide for you, not just through their thoughts or stories, but through places. Yeah. So it's really there is a strong bond.
Yeah, I want to emphasize this issue of place again, because I think it's so important. To me, it happened, for example, that I was sometimes having the interviews in the most convenient place where you reach easily some public cafe, and the person would feel maybe very uncomfortable about being seen like that. Also maybe in a place where you would usually not go, or she. And the other experience I have with public cafes especially, or other public places, is that it really makes your recording very difficult. So this is something that we often don't think ahead about, but it's so crucial in the end. Place.
No, absolutely. That's also a very good point, the logistical aspects of public places.
No, just I also think that this depends on the context, because I'm working in Palestine. And if I want to have the chance to interview people like farmers, they even don't go to cafeterias or something like that. So I have to go to their houses, otherwise I will not have chance to talk to them.
No, for sure, and I think this is why this field of political ecology is so important, because that really means that you adapt, what the books tell you, supposedly don't go to people's interior houses, to actually what it is that we are studying, and how do you get at the issues in question is by going through their houses.
I just wanted to draw the attention to some key points for me about interviews, which are, for example, when we work on, like in small villages, it's extremely difficult to have an interview with just one person, because many other people will gather in the houses or in the public spaces, in the plazas or small squares. So it would be really hard to get only the point of view from an individual, but it would be much more easier to have a whole interview with the community, which means that people are influencing each other. So it does not really guarantee or ensure you to have the perspective of just one person. But it's just like the position of the whole community, which might not correspond to the individual's interpretation or position about an issue. So it might be that personal opinions will never come up in an interview. So we should just take it into consideration. And I really found communities interview or groups interview as kind of a learning process for all parts, for all participants, let's say. So for the people and for us as well. Because we might also be asked about the situation in our countries. So it's really, it might be really interesting to share our experiences in our country, especially with communities which do not have much access to information from outside. So I really enjoy that kind of like learning process or for all of us. And then I would love to ask you a comment about gender issues. So for us, especially maybe for female researchers, for us it's easier to get access to women's group, so and vice versa. So I found it quite interesting to work with other researchers together with me, students or students/activists, and try to focus on different groups at the same time in the same village. And I really find it really challenging for a researcher proposal.
I haven't thought about the question of gender in a while, and I haven't come across the issue as much now as I had in the past, but I think that it's true that to have someone of confidence with you, whether you are a female or a male researcher on the field, someone from the community who can accompany you to meetings and guide you, and really be someone that you trust and trusts you and the people around trust as well, is important. And actually you might have also questions, and that's what I write here in the last bullet point. Try to be aware of power relationships and conflicts around the person, because you might think that the person is representative or that the person is really helpful, but actually there might be a lot of controversy surrounding him or her. So find out very much, what is the perception that the community has of this person. And I'll just finish. Yes, I'll just finish with the issue of language, because a lot of us end up doing work in countries that are not the one that we speak the language of, or if we do, we need to take into consideration some language issues anyway. So trying to hire a local research assistant, I think that's something that's much better than working with a translator. And I don't know what your experiences have been, but I have found that with translators, first of all, the text of your respondents or your text might get deformed, misinterpreted, or shortened through the translation. You lose the rapport, you lose this trust and relationship that you might have if you speak directly the language of the person. The interview ends up also being much more mechanical. You go through the questions without necessarily be able to ask probe, follow-up questions, and that does not necessarily lead you to rich information. Interviews are also generally much less long. They just go fast with a translator rather than with you asking them. And then it's also much more difficult to go to sensitive topics, I think, or more in-depth topics with an interview that, with an interviewer that doesn't speak your language, and vice versa. So I personally tend to stay away from countries that I don't speak the language of, not because I'm not interested, but because I think that it does not necessarily produce the wealth of research that I want. And if I need to, then I work with a research assistant rather than with a translator. And again, then you have the question of who is a research assistant, how do you train them, are you sure that they are respected in the community, if they are from the community, how do you make sure that the data is going to be conveyed the right way, etc. So there are a lot of logistical issues to work with a research assistant. Try to establish a rapport and a contact with the interviewee, even if you have a translator, and record if possible, so that you can maybe go back to the recording with someone else, with a professional translator, and make sure that everything that the person has said had been translated right there on the spot. Yes?
I would say record is really, in those situations, it may be really, really important. My film that will be screened here this week, it was a semi-structured interview that I did in the Amazon. And I decided to film. I had a small camera because they were really nice, the couple. And they got killed a couple months after. And those are the only images and the only interview that we have from them. So if I had left to another moment to have another interview, and I tried many times, it made I would never have, we in general, would never have this so important information. So in those delicate interviews, it's really important to, when we can, to record with everything that we have.
The research assistant, I would say that you would not necessarily, either you would be there, but just maybe just for the first few interviews, but afterwards you would just step out and the person would be the one going through the interview guide, asking the follow-up questions, the probe, in the language of the person, and they would have their exchange without you being in the middle and creating these obstacle to the communication, and then they would translate back to you later on, or you would actually just take the data with you and you would find a translator here or someone remotely to whom you send the audio file to translate it back in English or in the language that you work with. I think that for a PhD stage, it's first of all, it costs a lot of money to do that. Generally, it takes a lot of time to find these local research assistants, but I think that for many of us who've been at ICTA for a while, we see a lot of people working with research assistants in the big European projects or in a much bigger setup, because sometimes also you can't do all the research yourself, so you have to have research assistants help you. That's what I meant by that. Okay. So I think we're going to stop here for the first hour and a half. It is 11:35. Maybe let's come back here by noon 05. So the first part of the morning was about the interview techniques themselves and interview protocols and logistics. Now I'm going to delve more into the data analysis, which I think that is going to be less introductory to you. I wasn't sure how many of you had done extensive interviewing work before, so I prepared a presentation thinking at least everyone will have a common understanding. But now we will be doing more about the interview. So to show you a bit the group work this afternoon. Okay, that's in vivo. Okay, that's my stuff. So the group work, you will be divided. Probably I'll have to think about it over lunch to see how it works. But I was thinking in group of 2 or 3 maximum. Share your interview guide with each other, critique each other's guide, and then try to tweak your questions a bit if you were to ask some of them to marginalized versus elite individuals, just to play a little bit with your interview. And then we'll reconvene as a group. That will be the first part of it. And then we will be doing a coding exercises, which is a data analysis exercise. And I won't talk too much about it now, but that's the most important part in a way. I don't know how many of you have done coding, but that's really key for the way you organize your research. And then we'll finish something with the second stage after basic coding. Okay, so let me go now into data analysis. Okay, very briefly, because I want to have enough time for data analysis, so there is a stage between the time that you conduct the interviews to the time that you write something that has to do with field notes. And field notes is a stage that happens at many moments during your field work. And it can be used for interviews, for observations, for participant observations. It is not only in ethnographies, even though what you read generally about writing field notes has to do with writing ethnography field notes. And what do you do with field notes? You select, you interpret, and you make sense of your interviews and your observations. You note things that are significant for your research questions and the answers that you are hoping to seek. But you also write things that look more insignificant, such as the setting, the context. And they are not predetermined and pre-specified, and that's important, I think, is that you are not yet writing your findings. It is just a very preliminary stage of analysis so that you can go back to the interview and say, okay, there are these things that struck me during the interviews. Here is how the interviews took place. Here were the obstacles that I encountered during the interview. For instance, some of the questions that the person didn't want to ask, didn't want to answer, sorry. Or some of the moments where you found that the person contradicted themselves, or what were the moments that was most difficult for you. The most important thing is that try to preserve and capture the moment, the meanings behind people's work, and try to keep notes that will help you in a month, in 2 months, in a year after the interview, relive the moment and really put yourself back in the feet of the researcher that you were when you were in the field. So most specifically, what type of notes do you take? I think it's very important to be grounded in the specific context of the interview. Do not make statements that we're really trying to be generalizing statements. You need to think about what are your general impressions of the context, the scene, a participant, the settings, time and space. Think about the key events, the incidents, the conflicts. Think about very sensory details that you will have there. You know, the smells, the facial expressions, the landscape around you. What was the person bringing you to when you did the interview, if you are going with a farmer or if you are going with a resident of a community that has just been impacted by an oil refinery, for instance, or a waste site in a city. Try to think about people's emotions as well as your emotions, and also about the actions, the events that people talk to you about, and so that you can already maybe try to build a timeline if you are trying to reconstruct a conflict, for instance, or try to rebuild a mini timeline for that person's involvement in the conflict. And it's important here to take notes very quickly during the interview. I usually tend to write a lot of notes during the interview. As soon as I finish the interview, I reread the notes I took and I add some. And then also at night when I come home after I finish my 3 or 4 interviews of the day, I also write some more notes then. And the good thing is also about notes is that you can code your notes. You don't need to be just having them as the background of your research. You can analyze your notes and they form part of the interview data. Yes, I mean?
When you take notes during the interview, I assume that you have the recording anyway, so you don't need to note down the speech. But how don't you get into noting down what people say and then?
Oh, I do that too. No, that's what I mean. I write down everything that they say because I think that you don't always end up transcribing all of your interviews. So I write down during the interview everything that they say as fast as I can write. And then after the interview, I write more about the setting, the emotions, the conflicts that happen during the interviews, the difficulties. But during the interview, I just write everything about what they've said.
Okay.
Trying, of course, to make eye contact with the person in front of you and keep a relationship with the person. But I think this is just a quote by Emerson, who is one of the writers who has spent most time thinking about the power of field notes. And he says, "The ethnographer is like an artist," and he writes, "In summary, by participating in a setting with an eye to make jottings, an ethnographer experiences events as potential subjects for writing. Like any other writer, an ethnographer learns to recognize potential writing material and to see and hear it in terms of written descriptions. Learning to observe in order to make jottings, thus, is key to both the scene and the page. Ethnographers learn to experience with the senses in anticipation of writing, to remember dialogue and movement like an actor, to see colors, shapes, textures, and spatial relations as a painter or photographer, and to sense moods, rhythms, and tone of voice like a poet. Details experienced through the senses turn into jottings with active rather than passive verbs, sensory rather than analytic adjectives, and verbatim rather than summarized dialogue." So you can. Verbatim? Verbatim is talking a lot, fast, a lot of words together. I won't spend too much time on field notes, but I just wanted you to keep them in mind as also a very important moment of your data collection process. Now we are going to talk about the analysis itself. Tomorrow, Kate is going to be focusing more on discourse analysis. I'm presenting here another technique, which is grounded theory, which can be used, I think, for any type of data that you have. Just a little bit of background about why grounded theory and what grounded theory is, why it is important. The idea here is to do what Bruno Latour says, which is to reassemble the social. Try to think about how do people justify their actions? What rationalization do they use? What stories do they tell about something? What words do they use to explain something? For instance, their opposition to renewable energy. There's been a lot of push for it, but there has been also a lot of conflict about it. Is it necessarily about a NIMBY syndrome, not in my backyard syndrome, but just I want it in someone else's territory? Or is it more about place? Is it more about identity? Try to really recompose the social. And then you can think, Latour said there are 4 different ways that we can think about how human beings interact with each other. And there will be 2 of those that are important for qualitative data analysis and grounded theory. So the first one is the habitual, because it's conventional, because we've been trained to do it, because we've been socialized this way. We act also based on affect, because on emotions. We also are rational human beings, so we use means to reach an end, and we also do something because it's valuable in itself. It makes us feel good. It's also because we've been exposed through our religion, through our morale to it, so it feels good to do it. And the two last one, the rational one and the valuable in itself, is what you need to uncover in qualitative research and in grounded theory. So where are we here in the data analysis process stage? So we have this morning talked about the different forms of data collection, mostly interviews. I won't talk about the data organization itself per se, except that I will show you a little bit about NVivo, which is a database and a very powerful program to analyze your data, your qualitative data. Then you have the phase of data exploration, which is a little bit when field notes take place, as well as also the initial thinking, the initial memos that you can compose during or after your field work. Then you have the stage that's data sorting and condensing, and coding is what we will be focusing on now, and that's also complemented by memos, looking for relationships, models, queries, when you try to assemble your data you're finding into a visual marker of it, and then your findings and your write-up, which is the later stage of the paper writing or the chapter writing or the book writing, whatever you are using the data for. So for the principle, just very briefly, of grounded theory is that you are not pre-imposing what you think are categories of findings upon your data. You let it emerge from it, and you analyze it in a way that you will systematically summarize pieces of text in a much more synthetical way, so that then you can organize these texts in a different ways to find patterns. And the good thing here is that you are not doing it in a vacuum, and I insist on that. What will always guide you in your data analysis, what should always guide you, is your research question, which is why we insist so much in the school, and in general, I'm sure your advisors do that too, about the importance of research design. Research design, you have a problem, you have something that really puzzles you, that really something compels you, and then you want to study it. But then you also have to look at what's already written on the topic. And not necessarily about that conflict, because I've looked at a lot of the posters that you have, and we are all compelled about a particular conflict, about a particular protest, about a resistance movement. But your contribution, your scholarly contribution, is not going to be to understand exactly that particular conflict, because that conflict has never been studied before. That is not what you will be judged upon. You will be judged on your theoretical contribution to the field. How is that conflict helping me advance literature on environmental justice? What hasn't been done before? Or how is that testing the environmental justice literature in a different way, even contradicting some of the findings? Which is why these types of research questions, for instance, how do new types of slum projects affect crime perception in favelas? How do cities navigate complex and possibly contradictory agendas of climate adaptation on the one hand and development on the other? How do transportation agencies in the developing South plan for mega events, for instance, the Rio Olympics? So what you're trying to do here is really ask the general questions that will guide you. And again, I think it's important to ask research questions that are not necessarily including your case study inside, so that then you can have a broader response, and then look through your grounded theory work for the responses that will help answer the question. What type of causal explanation are you looking for? The causality is very important here. And then you will work with the literature. There is always a connection with the literature, and you will go back to your data. So it will always be a conversation between your data and the literature. Concretely, so the way grounded theory was theorized, that it happened in the 1960s, and there were two sociologists who were called Glaser and Strauss that you see here at the bottom. And there were two sociologists who were saying, we do not know the process of dying. We don't really understand it. We don't know how patients feel about it. So let us do a study in hospitals about how people die, and let us do it in ways that we don't pre-apply what we think dying means from the perspective of the caretakers, from the perspective of the doctors around, but really more from the people who are going through it. And so it was very powerful because it really built from the ground up, hence the words grounded theory, is that you did not come there with a pre-explanation, you really let the data emerge for you, and you as a researcher are more a medium for the data rather than, let's say, someone who is looking for variables, someone who is looking for almost like a quantifiable way of understanding your data. You let it go from the bottom up, which is why it's also called grounded theory. Raise your hand if you have worked with grounded theory so that I know what. So you haven't. Okay. Do you know what I mean when I mean coding?
In the article.
Okay, so you saw it in the articles. Okay. So what are the principles of grounded theory? As I was saying, you don't start with preconceived questions, no preconceived answers to the research question. You respond to the text as quickly as possible. Concretely, that means you have lines of text, and I'll look at that. I'll show you in the next slide. And you try to write summaries that reflect the content of that text, which means that, for instance, if you have a Word document, which is what we will work after, you will have, let's say, on the left side of the page, you have lines and lines of text, or paragraphs of text, which will be the answers to some questions. What you do is that you divide this paragraph into some, let's say, sub-paragraphs to which you will put a synthesis, like a few words, reflecting what that paragraph was about, what that person was talking about, and so you'll have the raw text on the left, and on the right you will have the summary, so that you can really systematically look at what someone has said, rather than just read the text and, okay, good, I found my answer, it's right here, it's then line 4 of this response. No, you really use everything, and then you reassemble in ways, and then you will really able to let emerge things you had never seen before. There is a concept that's very important, which is called intercoding reliability. What that means is that oftentimes when you work with a lot of interviews, you will not be the only one coding the data. You will be doing it with a colleague, with a professor, with a research assistant, and then at the end you will have your database with all the data coding. And what you want to make sure is that everyone codes the same way, meaning that more or less you read the text in a similar fashion, that someone is not going to interpret that particular answer a specific way and the other one will. Or that someone will not be coding just like 5 lines of text and then moving up to the next paragraph or something. So that's intercoding reliability. First of all, someone, let's say on the right, codes the text, someone on the left codes the text, then they bring the text together, they see how they've coded, then they go back, they do it again alone, until they really have a common way to do the coding. So you have different stages in grounded theory. You have the stage 1, which is what I've described for other techniques before, which is the note coding at the end of the interview, so you can code the notes you've taken. There is a systematic coding, which is your 20, 30, 40, 50 dissertation or postdoc interviews you can code. That's called systematic coding. Stage 3, that will be the memo writing, which is an intermediary stage between the interview analysis and the write-up of the paper. Then you have stage 4, which is having a visual representation of your data analysis, and then the stage 5, which is the write-up of the paper. So we won't be touching on everything, but at least you have an idea of what can be done. So systematic coding. You assign words to segments of text in a much more reduced and summarized way than the text itself. So you condense the data, and then once you have all of your summarized words, let's say, on the right, as I was saying in the Word document, I'll show you an example, or actually you work on an example this afternoon, then with that, you reassemble them in other segments that are similar, and that makes your code book. And then you can compare the segments together, and you add quotes to the segments. Let me show you how it works, because otherwise, we're going to be like, what is she talking about? So for instance, okay. So what we want you to do this afternoon is that it's an interview I conducted a few years ago with an activist who is working on an urban farm in Boston in the black neighborhood I was talking about before. The farm itself is called the Food Project, and it's supposed to be helping the revitalization of a neighborhood that had been impacted by a lot of contamination, a lot of waste dumping, and a lot of abandonment by the city. And so what residents did is that they organized and they created this urban farm, which was a way to improve the environmental quality of the ground, but also embellish the neighborhood and remake a place for residents. And the idea here is that on the right margin, so you read the text and you are going to have some little segments of text summarizing it. So the way that you do it is that you use, I mean, I'm doing it electronically, that's not the way you will do it, but if you did that electronically, say, and I'm not reading it right now just for the purpose of it, but you take a few sentences together, or you could do it sentence by sentence, but it's very cumbersome, or you just do it by theme too. I mean, you see that this is a pretty long paragraph, so the person is going to be talking about different things in that paragraph, and then, so say, so for instance, let's read the first few words. My title is the question. I would like to know if you could talk to me a little bit about your work and the responsibilities you have here in the Food Project. And she says, okay, my title is the Academic Year Program Coordinator. What the Academic Year Program is a continuation of our summer program into the academic calendar. It runs from September to December, and the idea is that the youth who start working here is that the first experience is like the introduction, and then the follow-up, and it's the academic program. Their responsibilities change and increase, etc. They work with a crew leader, then they become crew leaders. There is a lot of public skills involved, understanding leadership, compassion, and community. So you can see she's starting to weaving different things here. So the way that you would analyze that is that you could have the whole paragraph coded in one particular way, which would, for instance, be the subject of it, which would be the academic year program. She's describing here the academic year program. And then what you do, you underline that, you go to tools. Where is that? It's in Spanish. Damn it. How do you insert comments here? Herramientas. Comment. ¿Dónde está? Insertar comentario, vale. Okay, and so here, the way you code is that you could say academic year program, because this is what it is about. However, it's not only about the academic year program, because she talks about responsibilities and she talks about leadership. So what you can do is that you can add another code within here and says, okay, there is also something about for instance, all of this here is about insert another comment, and that's also about leadership creation, for instance. And then the last part of the paragraph has to do about growing out of the comfort zone, dynamics of dealing with diversity, and multicultural awareness. That comes up, youth from suburbia coming in, exposed, etc. So here, what would you code that for instance? I read it again. But actually really entering into a challenge zone where you grow the most and being able to understand the significance of that. And they apply it, hopefully, to their studies at school and their experiences that they create for themselves and their communities. That's what she describes that is also one of the role of the program. How would you summarize that segment of text, for instance? Just go ahead, because if with the microphone, it's going to take forever. What does that represent?
Building sense of place.
Okay, building sense of place. That's one way to summarize it. So you underlined it again, you had another comment, and you have sense. I would also say this is about personal growth, because it's people having to jump out of their comfort zone, know each other. She's talking about youth from suburbia, meeting youth from the inner city. So it's really learning about each other. And she talks about compassion. So you can even actually have one word here that summarizes everything, that's even a longer terms, for instance, and that you say, this is about compassion. Okay. So you can see how little by little you have different layers in the text, right? You have the bigger theme, which is, she's talking about the academic year program. So for instance, imagine you're writing a paper that would give you a lot of information. You know where you go in your document to be able to find background information about the academic year program. You want to talk about what are the different facets, what are the different features that the food project farm is about. But then in your data analysis, you start seeing other themes that appear that have to do with the deeper role that the food project plays in the community as a way to rebuild place. And so what you do after is that once you have your pages and pages of text analyzed these ways, you see what goes together. So you deconstruct and then you reconstruct the data and you build this code book. Vale. And I'm not building the code book on that excerpt because that's supposed to be your work this afternoon. So I'm giving you another example, which I've done for another research question, which is how does community policing help address illegal waste dumping in historically marginalized neighborhoods? So what happens a lot in the US is that you have trucks from contractors, different types of construction projects where the trash is being dumped in the backyards, in the gardens of Latinos and Black communities. So that's called illegal waste dumping. And as a response, you have people organizing, doing community policing. So it's not about crimes that have to do with violence and drug dealing, it has to do with environmental crimes. So that is the question. We imagine that you have, as interviewee, a bunch of people organizing into these community policies that organize during the day. And so the question about how does that help address illegal waste dumping in marginalized neighborhoods. So you conduct the interviews, and then you have your code book. So for instance, I have a code book that says, so I reread all my pages of coded text, and I see I have a code that's called dumping. But then this code dumping is divided into subcodes. So imagine it's like a tree and its branches. So yeah, imagine I have all of these interviews about these activists who are organizing against waste dumping. So then what I will notice throughout my text is that I will likely have different categories within dumping. I will have general waste dumping, illegal dumping, toxic dumping, for instance. Then what I do is that I put a little description below each of them that tells me what is general waste dumping in the mind of activists. So I explain. Waste dumping consists in trucks from contractors throughout the city unloading their waste inside people's backyard. What is illegal dumping? Illegal dumping is the process by which such and such laws of the cities or municipal ordinances are being violated. What is toxic dumping? I say this is the testimonies of people explaining the health impacts that they have suffered from this dumping. And then what I do is that I use quotes. And where do the quotes come from? Imagine that was this other document here. I would basically take this quote, copy it here. Imagine, it's just not going to happen now. And then I would add it here. Okay? And then I would add at the end the name of the respondent. And then I would have quotes and quotes and quotes about these specific themes. And as you can see, quotes can be used for several codes, because sometimes they have different content, right? One, for instance, would be a huge quote about the academic year program, and another quote would be just a few lines showing this idea of compassion and responsibility. So let's just take that out for now, for instance. And the good thing about grounded theory is that the way you can see it happen is that you bring interviews together. So here in dumping, you would probably have 10 people talking to you or 15 people talking to you about dumping, but they would do it in different ways. And so you would have different interviews here within this general code called dumping, right? It's not only for one interview. Every time you have a different interview, but where this theme comes in, you are going to add the quotes there and say which person that is, so that you have a way to go back easily to it and say, okay, this quote is helpful. And so then you go down, and you also can write a memo, which would be this intermediary stage between the data analysis itself and the report that you are writing.
Do you think it's more helpful when you have this coding to have different code books for different players, or put it all together? For example, in a way for a movement, do you put in the same code book how the people in the movement react and how the company, for example, react in the same questions? Or do you have different code books?
You have one code book, but then you have different themes, and according to the different, let's say, subsections of the code book, you will have more of the other people in it. So let me show you, for instance. Here, this is only the code book, or let's say the tree, better said, on dumping. Then you would have another code on the context of dumping. So people, for instance, talking about the historical circumstances. Who are the offenders? What are the locations? And this with a description and with quote. Then something else about the perception of dumping. What do people think about dumping? And that might have to do with trying to start making an explanation about how do people organize to address illegal dumping. So people perceive it's an environmental crime. People perceive it's violence against powerless people. Others will tell you it's racism. Others will tell you it's classism. And so this perception influences their action. Next one, community organizing against dumping. That will probably be a huge tree and branches because this is the really center of your interviews. So what will you have codes on? You will have probably the process of organizing. So you can add quotes where people tell you how they came to be part of this movement of community policing. And then you will even have sub-branches. For instance, one will be the roots of organizing, deeper roots of organizing. Another subcode called initial decision to take action. Then you will have the different actors that have to do with it. The organizers, the residents, and even the reaction of the offenders themselves, which might be the companies that you might be referring to. Also the responses of the city, that's an actor per se as well, because it's letting the companies do it without any penalty. Then you also have another code called tactical tools. How do people fight? They fight doing sittings and chaining themselves against trees, for instance. That was the case in the neighborhood I studied. They report these crimes. They do protest. They do shaming, which means that they use newspapers and social media to shame the company online. And this you can see, or if you study social movements, you can also see that this is starting to be some categories that are very used in the social movement literature about strategies and tactics. You can't see. Per. Zoom. Porcentaje. Vale. Okay. So yes, the process of organizing would be a tree with its own branches, then the actors, then the tactical tools used, and then you would have a memo on, for instance, direct actions. What is the type of direct actions that people use, and how is that direct action effective? Okay, that's it. And you can see that this is slowly helping you understand what you are seeking. How does community policing help address illegal waste dumping in historically marginalized neighborhoods? So that's just a short example I wanted to give you. Let me go into a tiny bit more of detail in coding, and then you can ask all the questions you want, because I realize that this is a little bit abstract, especially until you've done it. Okay. So when you see a fragment of text that can be 20, 30 lines, 2 or 3 pages sometimes, of one response for only one question, or a long response for one question. So what are the questions that can guide you? What processes are at stake here? You know, when the person is describing something, how can I define it? How can I summarize it? How can I categorize it? How does this process develop? How does the participant act while he or she is involved in this process? What does he think? What does she think or feel when involved in the process? What might his behavior or her behavior indicate? When, why, and how does a process change, and what are the consequences of the process? And I'm talking here, I'm using a lot the word process because I know a lot of you study resistance, conflicts, tensions, and I think that that talks a little bit more to your research. That's an extremely important slide for you to keep for a long time in case you do grounded theory. This is the different types of coding, because you can see that in the short abstract we just coded, we've done different types of coding. The first one we've done is called open coding, which means we have read the text line by line, and we have asked ourselves, what is this about? And then what we do is that we have broken them into subcodes, into these branches. For instance, violence will become perceived violence, experienced violence, witnessed violence. So we have them into more specific categories. Some people do the other way when they do coding. They start with something already very, very specific. Like I almost tend to do it not the wrong way, but that way. That is coding a lot, like having multiple layers on one paragraph, and then aggregating it into these broader trees and branches that I was describing to you. So that's called open coding, this line by line, very close to the text coding. The second aspect is what we've done next, which was focus coding, which is using the most significant and frequent codes through your data to synthesize and explain and reorganize larger fragments of text. Then there is something that's called axial coding, which is more specific, and it's structuring the data into broader themes. So it's something more thematic. So for instance, context, causal conditions, action strategies, narratives, impacts of actions, etc. Then you have something that's called theoretical coding, which is why what I was telling you earlier about bringing the literature within your data is very important, is that sometimes, for instance, that code I had about compassion, or personal growth, or relationship, that has to do a lot with the literature on place remaking. And so then I can add codes in the margin that are already theoretically focused codes, like, you know, remaking place, sense of community. This is something that already has a theoretical power. In your case, for instance, feeling of injustice, feeling of structural racism. That would be something that not someone would tell you right away. You would have to say these sentences together from someone saying that they have been targeted because they are indigenous, because the state has never protected them, because there are no laws for them to keep their territory intact when an oil company comes. This is structural racism, so this is already a theoretical coding if you use these words. And oftentimes you combine those 4 types and you do what's called level of meaning coding. You have different levels that will be able to reconstruct the coding. Something that's neat too is this in vivo code. In vivo means that you will use the terms of the respondent and you will just use it and put it in the margin of your document, and that can already be a category, because sometimes you realize there are things that are very powerful that people say and that you didn't realize was that important before. So you use them in ways that you just reproduce their own language, and then you can even write a memo about something. Well, that is what we have done in the Word document. So, okay. no, here, when we have, this would be more the focus coding, which is when we have reorganized the different fragments of text within different categories. So general waste dumping, illegal dumping, toxic dumping, that is the focus coding. The open coding is that document that you will also be working with this afternoon, which is this one. That's the open line by line coding, when we have just adding things in the margin of the document. Please. Okay. So the ways to do it is just a summary of what we have just done. We have used the commenting option in Word to write codes in the margin for all the data. What I think is pretty helpful too is to be able to take advantage of the colors that you have in Microsoft Word, meaning that you can underline the text in different colors that talk to the most important themes of the data. So for one, for instance, you would have, for instance, in green, all of the quotes that have to do with the timeline of a conflict, so that then you can look at all of the interviews and everything that will be green. You know that it will help you reconstruct the events over 10 years or over 5 years. You can use something in red, for instance, that would be about violence, everything that is about violence. And you can use 20, 30, 40 colors, whatever you can, although at some point the saturation would be a bit hard to deal with. But you can use also colors for different themes so that it's easy for you to find the data. Then what you do is that you copy, do not cut, your codes and also the quotes that go with them into this other document. That was the second document we worked with. Then you also can write the memos on very important things that you have encountered in the data. And very important, make multiple copies of your transcripts, which means that, we have the pages of raw data, you save that as one document. Then you save it as when you want to do the line by line open coding, because otherwise you will find your interview truncated and it will go from 20 pages to 2 pages because you will have cut things instead of pasting them. So that happens to everyone. There are two softwares that do this work very well, NVivo and Atlas TI. I think that tomorrow Kate will show you Atlas. I'm going to just show you a very brief demo on NVivo so that you can see how you can do it in a more complex way. I think Word is very helpful. It's more or less free at this point. NVivo and Atlas TI cost. I don't love Atlas TI because I think it looks like a software from the 70s, and I don't really want to have an Atari in front of me. But it's cheaper than NVivo. That's another. Of? So what I've done, so now NVivo is at the 10th version. You can find it, you can find it cracked, number 7 and number 8, I think. The important thing is NVivo is that it's only it's only a PC. And so if you have a Mac, you have to have VMware, you have to have Boot Camp to work with it. But the good news is that NVivo will release a Mac version finally this year in December. And you can apply to be test users. That's what I just done actually this morning. You can apply to be test users, and if you test it nicely, they give you a free copy, which is worth 500 euros. So you could try to do it. That's another example of the construction of a code book. So on the right, you have the raw data, then you have the description, and then you have the code of what the person says. So for instance, that has to do with the concept of teaching, and that I think was in one of the readings I gave you from Cassie Sharmaz. So for instance, because that then allows the children to use all different strategies to apply and figure out an answer. And there is not that one right answer, which I think is important for me to get kids away from. There is more than one way. It's okay, you and I didn't do it the same way. What's the description? The teachers who states and alludes to a belief that learner must construct meanings for mathematical ideas on the basis of the learner's existing conceptions that may be quite different from those of the teacher. It's a bit more elaborate here than what the text states because it's in the context of a broader interview that the person knows the content of. The code is conception-based reference. It's a theory that's based more in their field, not in our field. Then another quote, for instance. I think you can see it in a child who, for lack of better term, is streetwise. You know, they understand what a concept of a number is. Like if you have $5 and you know that you can buy X, Y, and Z with $5, then they know 5 is more than 2. And then what does that mean? Teacher makes direct, indirect reference to specific elements of students' culture or background that may impact the teaching, learning process. She calls that cultural references. I would maybe have called that more social referencing, but that doesn't really matter. So in the end, you can see, it's taking a raw fragment of text, then having a code based on it, and then later having also a little description to know what that was about. Yeah?
How to avoid the risk of superimposing our interpretation to the actual words that we listened? Because also in this case, I think the description is really going a little bit more far than the words we can read.
Well, I think here what matters is that, you know, for us it's just a little fragment of text, so we don't really know what the broader context is. I say it's very important to respond very quickly to the data. Like not overthink, you know, 20 times, what is that segment of text telling me? It's supposed to be fast, 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 because imagine like you have so many different lines and lines of text when you do an interview. So you read quickly, okay, that says that, and then you add a few more lines of text. Oh God, that actually was linked together. Let's add another code in the margin that says that. So I think doing it as quick as possible without reflecting on it is very important, because it's supposed to be more like a machine. That's why it's called grounded theory, that it's not you who starts going back to your books right away and starts saying, okay, this is what it means. It's you who just summarizes very quickly, as if you were on TV, you know, and you had to say an answer very quickly without thinking too much. The next slide is on the memos themselves. Do you have any questions on that? What can I answer that might be not clear or been going too fast? I mean, I think when you start doing it during the day, you will have a chance to see that it talks more to you than the abstract way I've been describing it now. And I'll show you also this program in vivo, how it works. Okay, so the memo writing stage. This is also the principle of grounded theory, is that you have to have a memo stage after you've coded your data. This is going to be the intermediate stage between the coding and the write-up of the paper. And same thing as the coding. Write them quickly and spontaneously. You know, what are your feelings? What are your first impressions when you have to write a code about experienced waste dumping in this neighborhood? How are people reacting to it? Who are the actors? Just don't be afraid. You're not here to be doing extensive editing. It's for you. And that's also what the power of that is that this memo talks about you as a researcher. You don't have to share that with your advisor. It's about this stage of you thinking about your data, making comparison between different actors, between different interviewees, not losing your references to the text. You make comparison between one interview and the other interview, between one code and another code, between codes and categories, you know, categories between being broader than codes. You also have 3 types of memos that you can use. So just a descriptive memo to summarize the data. So for instance, if you want to summarize an event, a protest, an election, the arrival of a new company in the rainforest, you know, something that will just be putting things in order in time and in space, I would say. Then you have memos that have quotes and that are a little bit more analytical, because you are trying to make sense of people's, you know, interpretations of their world, what they have done. And then you have the analytical memos, which are almost actually pieces of your chapters together, or pieces of your results section, because you write ideas about your analysis and how you have interpreted the data. And I would say that probably the descriptive memos would be the one that you can use into the case study description part of your paper, whereas the analytical memos have more to do with the results section. And these memos are great because oftentimes, because they reflect what you have been thinking about, they also help you address what are the gaps in the data collection and actually also in the data analysis. And that can be a bad realization, as we know. Okay, so just an example of a memo. Still based on the same example that we had before about illegal waste dumping in a marginalized neighborhood. So here, what I would do is I would interview different residents who are active in community policing and see how they have experienced and reacted to this dumping over the years. And so if you have a memo that's quite basic and that shows just your very first raw impressions of the text, you can say, I feel that female residents perceive criminal dumping activity differently for males. I feel that residents who work in community policing perceive dumping in a more acute way. And so that would be the first very basic sentence of opening the memo. And then you start justifying, or you start going more in depth. For instance, why do residents who work in community policing perceive it in a more acute way? Because they have seen it firsthand, because they have talked to the offenders, because actually they have been more in touch with the victims, they have gathered samples, blood samples, for instance, to test lead, because these people are the ones who have a more deep attachment to the place, which is also why they have been active in community policing. They have a broader, they have a deeper sense of community that makes them want to act for this place. And then you look at the data and you find evidence and you have your quotes there to illustrate that, and you start building your argument. And then you look at the literature, in the middle of your memo, and you say, actually, what does the literature tell me about the role of community policing as a tactic to address illegal dumping? And that has to do, for instance, with the literature on environmental justice that is about the strategies and tactics that activists take to address environmental inequalities on their territory. And one of the strategies will have to do with bringing lawsuits to the corporation, shaming. But this is actually quite new, and this is also your theoretical contribution. What is the role of community policing in addressing these inequalities? How is that complementary to other techniques that they use, or the tactics that they use? How important is the role of place in that? Because people have really to be invested in their territory. They go out at night, during the day, to look for the trucks, to write down license plates. They follow the trucks during the city so that the offenders get, a little bit scared. So that has a very different relationship to the territory than writing a blog on, on Facebook or something about an offender coming in. So this is part of your theoretical contribution. And then you also can build, at this point in stage, models and relationships. So you have identified themes, sub-things, what are the most important variables here, what are the most important processes, and you can start putting them in a figure, in a box of some point sort. You'll have arrows, you'll have circles, you'll have everything that will just, as with any other paper that you have written, you will have things that represent visually your data. So for instance, going back to this question, how does community policing help address illegal waste dumping? You are going to show the different mechanisms that help going from stage one, which was waste in backyards and in people's housing, to having a cleaner community. What have been the different tactics in the meantime? What have been the different allies and coalitions and stakeholders that have helped address illegal waste dumping? And you have a model about that. And then you have the best stage in a way, and the most difficult one, which is the write-up. And what's very important here is that you're like, oh my God, I have so many codes, I have so many memos. What am I starting with, and how am I writing 5,000 words? Because that's basically more or less, in a journal article, the space that you have to write your data. How am I going to write everything in 5,000 words when I have 25 interviews? First, the great thing is that not everything that you have collected is going to go in a paper. You might write 3 or 4 or 5 papers in the end with all the data you have collected. So you need to focus on what was my research question for the paper, and what are the findings, what are like 4 or 5 key findings that are organized around a story, around an argument that help me answer my research questions. So you aggregate things together. What do people talk about when they talk about community and environmental community policing? What do they talk about when they talk about NGO-based climate adaptation? Whatever your topic is about, you have to build a story, and you have to focus on it so that the reader, coming back to the first slide I had about creating meaning, creating a story, what is the main gist? What is the main point? And how can you support it through this grounded theory work? Okay. I want to show you. Giacomo, until what time do we have?
Half an hour.
Oh, okay. Until 2. Okay, great. So I want to show you a little. Oh, yeah, no, yes. Actually, now is a good time to stop for questions.
I'm not sure if I'm wrong, but I have the impression that this is a very organized way of analyzing and working with your data.
Mm-hmm. The reality is not like that, right?
Sorry?
The reality is not like that.
No, like I want to ask you if you think that this impressive way of, I mean, it sounds all so logical and very, like I would like to use this to work with,
mm-hmm.
but knowing that many people are so more disorganized, let's say, I'm wondering if you think this is above average of what we should aspire to.
No, not at all. No. I mean, if it can, okay. No, but if it can reassure you, so for some of you actually who were in the class, I did a very similar exercise with students in a master's degree in environmental studies at ICTA a few months ago, and the wide majority of them were engineers. They had no idea about qualitative research. They had never done an interview before. So first they did interviews. They did like four or five interviews. I forgot. And then they reorganized their data and wrote results. And so if they can do it with an engineering background, you guys who have done interviews, who know what you're doing, you can perfectly do it. What's daunting, of course, is that it means you have to have all your notes, if not all your interviews, all your notes transcribed, so that you can do it, you can write these comments on the margin, these codes on the margins. You can't just read your notebook and try to cherry pick what you think is going to work out for your argument. But I think this is what good research, what we should all aim to do as good research, and especially for those of you who are doing your PhD, you will really much be judged on that, on the methods, on the data analysis. And I think sometimes, honestly, the advisors are not as rigorous as they should be. And especially those who have been working for a long, long time, they're like, just go and, first of all, they're like, just go to the field, conduct your interviews, come back, and then we'll write something together. And then, they judge you on, I don't know if that's something that reminds you of things, but of processes. But, I mean, I think this is why we also are having this summer school. It's because good research also means good design, good research questions, and good methods, and good analysis. And this, because also, that's why also afterwards I want to show you something that's based on my research, is because I think in the end, you unravel things you had never thought about. Because you will realize that there are these codes that come, that emerge, and you're like, God, I just didn't even think about that as the interview was happening. So you can also have much more theoretically powerful results that will be better received by journals because you have this type of work. It will be more surprising. And what's surprising is what they like in journals, what's innovative about it. Yes, Johannes.
In our current research, we are working with a fixed framework, theoretical framework.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So starting the coding would not start with an open coding then, right? So I could start from the other side as well, from the theoretical, or from the actual part.
It's a question. Yes. No, you could do that. I'm not sure it would be called grounded theory as much. In the end, you could just say it was, a systematic type of coding. I wouldn't call that grounded theory. But I see what you're saying. Because Johannes is working with the framework of ecosystem services and the different types and values of ecosystem services. So they are already pre-categorized. But in a way, your contribution could be that actually you might add to this existing framework through this type of work. So actually, I think you can totally use it and actually see how maybe this framework you can offer to complement it or to revise it. That will be also an interesting theoretical contribution. Yes.
Isabelle, it's a quite similar question. Do you think we could use the same methodology if we are working with press release data?
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely, you can work with everything. Okay. That's also something that the little video demo will show you, is that you can work with videos, you can work with photos, because you can have descriptions of what you see. You can transcribe a video, you can write notes about a photo, for instance, and say, this is what I see on the photos, the context of which it was taken, what is the landscape, what are the actors, what is the conflict, what is the setting. So you can do grounded theory with everything. And of course with press excerpts as well, with newspaper articles, with archives. Because the idea is that you just use whatever format you have at first, you transfer it into text, and then you code this text using this very systematic way of summarizing the data. So yes, for sure. Yes.
I really am. I wish I could meet you at the beginning of my PhD, because I was in my first year of PhD not even thinking about these things, and then in my fourth year of PhD also thinking that I have so rich information, so good information, I don't need to organize them, and I didn't organize them. Well, I could publish some things without organizing my information so well, but now I feel I lost a lot. And the most pragmatic way, you realize that you are losing points because you don't think of all these details, is when you start writing another proposal, research proposal. Because my last two research proposals were also weak. My major weakness was exactly this methodological laziness. So I think it's great that you are showing us in so much detail. I really appreciate. That's all I want to say.
Well, this is not something I'm showing. I'm just like, this is also something I learned during my PhD. I had to take a class in that. So do not praise me, praise the people who trained me.
I didn't have so much specific regulation
for that. It also honestly depends on your advisor. Again, I had an advisor who just didn't let me fly. I had a horrible PhD at the end of the day. But I learned a lot too. But I also think that you might not do that for every single one of the papers you write. But if you want to, if you have one core paper you want to write about a conflict, it would be great for you to be able to do this systematic coding, for sure. And then it's also complicated when you do collaborative research, because you have to make sure someone else knows how to do it.
The difference between grounded theory and coding, because from what I understood, grounded theory is very much, it's a philosophical approach to research as well, in the sense that
yes.
I always associated it with something that's more social constructivist. So you go not necessarily with the fixed relationships in mind, but you're trying to build the theory from what you're learning.
Yeah.
So I think this is something that's a bit, because you can also use coding in a different context, and I just was wondering if you could maybe clarify that a bit.
Yes, no, you're right. People use also grounded theory as just an approach to research with more what you're talking about, this social constructivism. So you don't pre-apply already what you see is happening, but you really think that the world is built through the actions, through the meaning, through the thoughts of people. And so you really come there being open to what you will find, rather than you already expecting to these things. So that's more a grounded theory approach. In data analysis, grounded theory is this idea of going from the bottom up, letting the text talk to you and you systematically writing summaries. Coding is just an exercise that you can do in many different techniques, which is to be summarizing and categorizing and reorganizing your data. So you have many ways of doing coding. I was just showing you the different types of codes in data analysis using grounded theory. Yes?
Continuing in the same framework, as an advice, do you think that if you want to somehow... No. as a general advice, if you want to be based, let's say, on ground theory, do you think that looking into the controversial points are the key points that you have to do? For example, that's why I asked before about the key players, because I think that if you go from the bottom to the top, you see that there are some key points that have to do with controversial aspects or controversial ways that people think on the same issues. For example, what is toxic waste dumping in this area? I think you get different approaches from the people who live there, from the workers in a company that does this, or even from the people in the headquarters of the company. So do you think it's, I try to find it as a, not a very typical way, but as a advice on whether to start with on your way from bottom, from down up to the way you...
What I mean from bottom up is not like a hierarchical way of thinking about the people. It's more like the data is your bottom, and you are the researcher up writing. I'm not thinking about, company versus worker versus resident. So that's what I meant by, that's what I meant by bottom up. But I think that you're looking at the controversies, looking at the gray points is what's most interesting, because some of us were talking during the breaks that we all have this image, oh, the community, they are the victims, they are the people who are being infringed upon their rights and their land. But in the end, you realize the community is not one single unit. There are people who are working with companies, with the government. There are people who want something else for themselves. And so these controversies, these internal conflicts is what's really important to do the coding around, for sure, because this is where your more unexpected findings will be, and the more rich ones, for sure.
How important do you think it is also to interview people that are not directly involved in the mobilization, for example? To sort have people that live in the community, residents, but that are not taking part, to sort have also the other side of the story of people who do not participate. And would this enlarge too much the sample, or would be of actual interest?
No, this is a good point too. I try to have in general an idea of what's happening outside the main stakeholders I'm interviewing. So I think that starting to do formal interviewing is really difficult, because where do you start, where do you stop? Because you don't have anymore this purposive key respondents sample. I do try to interview the opponents, for sure, the people who are not supporting the projects and who are being very vocal about it. But people who are neutral, who just have nothing to do with it, I don't think they would bring necessarily that much depth to my own work. Like, not everyone can be active, for instance, as an organizer. But I try to have an idea of, what are the different tendencies? Are the people I'm interviewing a tiny minority? Because that's important too. They could be vocal and they could be a tiny minority, and in the end, they're just the loudest one, but they're not the representative one. So that's what I'm trying to get at, but not necessarily interviewing formally everyone, because you never stop, and you don't know exactly if they are representative. Yes?
I want to ask you how we can manage the contradictions that emerge within a person's interview, because it is a problem that I have noticed in the past. In which ways, specific ways, because if we write what we have heard, we can see a lot of, sometimes we can see contradictions within the same interview, and are there any specific ways to manage these things and to separate or to...
That's tricky, for sure. That is tricky. I would ask a lot of probing questions. So I try to jump on the first time I see a contradiction and say, you said earlier something that was a little bit different. Could you explain me a little bit why you are presenting a different perspective now? I try to ask, why do you say this now? Mm-hmm. That's a problem. No, then for sure you can have a second follow-up interviews, because I think that a lot of us end up having one or two interviews, or you can have a brief, phone conversation with someone saying, oh, by the way, I forgot to ask you that, or I realized you said something and I should have reacted. Like, question yourself in front of the person so that they feel that you are humble, and then try to make a follow-up interview, because contradictions are important, but God, if you can't understand them, this is like text you can't use. So I would try to go back to them.
I do think one important thing is that if we are studying a long-term process, not a conflict in just in one time, but that it takes quite a lot of time, it's important to include in the coding, or at least somehow, when the situation takes place. Because afterwards, if you don't do it at the proper time, then when you want to study the analysis on the timing, it becomes a nightmare. So it's just a recommendation from the past bad experiences for myself.
Yeah, you don't know where to look for the information, for sure.
Okay, I wanted to ask actually 2 questions. So, first of all, I'm still a little bit confused. If I want to look at, let's say, anti-mining and popular environmentalism, yeah, would it be bad research if I don't interview the more, let's say, corporate representatives or the state officials or something like that? Because I'm only interested in, let's say, the social movements rather than, would it look bad if I don't interview? So it's not mandatory to do interviews with everybody in a community, right?
No, it's not mandatory at all. I just think that it helps you it helps you have a better picture of the whole stakeholder, platform that you have. And I think in the conflicts that we tend to study, it's so complex that even though you are not going to do too much with those other voices, I think knowing a little bit the relationships, even if they are negative, between what you are really focusing on and the other side, can be helpful, can give you some insight, and can have you get just like a fuller picture. Let's put it that way. And in the end, when you think about it, it might not be that many extra people that you interview. It's 1 or 2 people in the company, 1 or 2 public officials. So that's a minority of what you end up interviewing. But I think it helps you have a broader view of everyone.
Okay, thanks. I think,
well, we have another 20 minutes, so I want to show you just a little bit about NVivo and then give you a case in point. Okay, so NVivo. What's NVivo? This is the qualitative data software to record, display, organize, and structure qualitative data. It helps you, so it's basically a very, very complex version of Word, but also in a way much more user-friendly than Word, because you have one single platform where you can do the whole work. It allows you for rigorous and systematical coding, and it reorganizes it in a way that is very visually appealing. And very importantly, because of what I was telling you before, it really helps you uncover hidden elements of your answers that you were not thinking about before, because you are not just cherry-picking what you wanted to see in the interviews. And you can do it with everything. And supports multiple languages.
Because it is actually the program
it's a program
that goes through the text. That's why it's not cherry-picking, because it's the
exactly. No, it's not the program. The program is just the platform. You need to do the whole work, but that would be the good day. No.
No, in the sense, maybe you ask the program to look for...
Yes. Well, okay, here's the thing. The program does 2 things. First, you import, let me show you. Well, I won't show you. First, the program imports data. So, you have a ways to bring in Excel tables, documents, JPEG images, things from the web, HTML, etc. And then it's you who does the summary of the data and organize it into these different trees and branches. But then you can run searches and queries, and then that's the power of the program, like Stata or R or whatever you use SAS in statistical analysis. So you can ask, what is the frequency of having used the term illegal waste dumping in all of my interviews? Well, it will tell you how many times, but it will also allow you to see who has said it. We'll brush on that, because that you'll be able, this is what's called a query in NVivo. So this is, for instance, an example of queries, and I know it's a little bit small, but you have different ways that you can do queries once you've coded the text in NVivo. You can do a text search, so it finds all of the occurrences of a word, a phrase, or a concept. So for instance, finds and analyze all occurrences of the phrase alternative energy. Find the words policy or legislation and code them at something that's called government. Find all of the references to river. Okay? Then you have something called word frequency, which is find the most frequently occurring words or concepts. And it's interesting because it will look for the most frequently occurring words in a set of interviews. And you might find at the top 10 or 20 of these occurrences words that you had not even, or expressions that you had not even considered before. Then you can do also a coding query, which is finding all content coded at a selected node. A node is like a little branch of a tree, or a combination of nodes. So for instance, show me where the content is coded at coral bleaching at the same time as it is coded at rising sea temperatures. So you can see the relationship between coral bleaching and rising sea temperature. You can also ask NVivo to tell you what do property developers say about rising sea levels. You run a query to gather content that has been coding at rising sea levels and also the attribute, which is the type of people that was interviewed, called property developer. So you can see, first you import all of your documents and you will categorize them by property developers, farmers, government officials, real estate agency, whatever you have, and then you can run a query that will be within this particular attribute, which is farmers. What do they have to say about raising sea level? Then you have a more complex coding, which is called matrix coding. Matrix, which is called matrix coding, and then you find a combination of items and display the results in a table. So for instance, NVivo will help you run, compare what small, medium, and large businesses have to say about alternative energy. So you will have your table with the 3 columns about small, medium, and large businesses, and then you will have this category called alternative energy and the words that are being used. And finally, the last, most complex type of query is the compound query. And for instance, you find context where the term rising sea level precedes the content coded at coral. Or for instance, you find content where the words habitat and sustainable occur in the same paragraph. I have not always used queries as much. I have found that the way I have built trees and then my model has been helpful enough, but many people use and love those queries. So the example I showed you again, it was not because it is the most amazing research in the world, although I would love to know, but it's just because you can see how I worked with it. So my main research question, that was my dissertation, my main research question was why and how do seemingly marginalized neighborhoods proactively organize to improve environmental quality and livability in a variety of political systems and histories of urbanization. So we'll talk more about that when we meet in Syros. I think all of you will go there. So I won't go too much in the content of my research, but what I did in my PhD is that I looked at 3 neighborhoods that were marginalized in 3 different cities, Boston, Barcelona, and Havana, and I looked within each neighborhood how people worked to really drastically transform the neighborhood and the environmental quality of it. So there was a lot of dumping before, refineries, contaminants leaching in the ground, abandoned lots, space with asbestos, etc. And people really took action in those 3 different settings to do it. And so it was interesting. I was like, God, you know, they could just leave, or it's not something that they would be compelled necessarily of doing, being so proactive and doing something on so many different domains, because they built an urban farm, they went and worked and built new parks, playgrounds, they had farmers markets, etc. So they were extremely active. So the other questions I was asking for is how do underlying demands and goals shape community organization for greater urban livability? And so all of these being grounded in the environmental justice literature, and there was a lot of conflicts in the communities, so that's what I ended up studying. If you go to the analysis itself, so I analyzed all of the different projects that had helped the residents transform their neighborhoods, which went from community gardens, urban parks, healthy housing, improved waste collection, alternative energy systems, etc. And I looked at, just to summarize you, the work of residents around it. And I had 148 interviews, which was a lot of time coding these interviews. And what was really interesting to me is that because of the queries I ran and because of the way I organized the data, or coded the data, is that there was a lot of emergent of unexpected things that the literature also itself doesn't tell me. One of it was about grief and loss, emotional fulfillment, war zone, nurturing, and safe havens. And how was that important is because I never realized before I went there that people were extremely traumatized by what they had seen, by they had lived, and they were considering that their neighborhood that was abandoned there was a lot of dumping, was like a war zone. And so the words were really showing a lot of emotional sense of loss, of fear of erasure, people going through therapies, individual and group therapies, feeling abandoned by the cities. And it was not only this question that you usually see in environmental justice about structural racism, classism. It was really about individual people feeling that they just were dying slowly there, and that also psychologically, these projects were helping them remake a place for themselves and reconstruct themselves physically and psychologically. Which is why the codes that ended up being the most important, there were maybe 4 of my tree, let's say, trunks of the trees. So one was neighborhood environmental revitalization, which had subcodes that had to do with moving across domains, comprehensive benefits, broadening definitions of environmental goods, quality of life, and community development. And the interesting aspect for me in the words of the people is that the idea of broadening definitions of environmental goods. For instance, they were saying there is a lot of crime in the neighborhood and there is a lot of impossibility for kids to go to parks and to go to playgrounds because of the violence that happens in the community and the drug dealing. So we built a big community center, and for us that's green. We don't care if the city tells us that's not green, but for funding for that, we want to go to the Department of Green Space and Environmental Protection, and we'll get money because we'll have a green roof above there, we'll have a gym, we'll have all of the types of equipment we put outdoors, but because our neighborhood is so blighted and so messed up, we just have to have it indoors. So for them, they were saying, this is our definition of being green, and this is the way we want to be seen. We are doing an environmental project. So that's one of the aspects that I wanted to emphasize. The other one that you read in the paper, if you read the paper, had to do with place attachment. People, even though they were living in this blighted, abandoned community, were feeling strongly attached to their neighborhood with all these subcodes I have here. There are importance of the whole trauma, urban war, grief and loss, fear of erasure, and then finally something much more positive, which had to do with neighborhood as refuge. How do you use those green spaces not as an end per se, but as a goal to really strengthen the identity of residents between themselves and also feel people comfortable with each other and with themselves. And that's, in a way, the starting of my argument, going from the trauma to the reconstruction.
Isabelle.
Yes?
The microphone.
Going from the trauma to the good. And then I ended up in Vivo building these models which say that usually the literature on environmental justice has to do with physical health aspects, so what we all tend to study, you know, the idea that air and soil cannot be contaminated, should not be contaminating, that we have access to fresh and healthy food, physical activity, safe play, healthy homes and habitat. Anyway, this is maybe not as much in the context of Europe and what you study, but in environmental justice in cities, that's very much the emphasis, physical health. And my theoretical contribution in this research had to do with the mental health aspect, those environmental projects as a way to rebuild themselves. So that's a model that you can do with NVivo. Group work for this afternoon. So let's just finish now with the video, unless you have any questions. Did I go too fast? Maybe I went a bit fast. So she was talking, the speaker was talking about these nodes. And she was organizing them like in the same hierarchy, nodes after nodes after nodes. Then what you can do is put all these nodes together into a broader node, and then, put everything under that. So you can also categorize and hierarchize the nodes that you have. So you will have nodes and subnodes. So yeah, if you are interested in delving more into that, I would recommend that you invest either time on downloading the software somewhere or buying it if you can, but it's really, really powerful, and you can see it's also much more visually appealing than Word, because you don't need to be running 2 or 3 different Word documents together. You just have everything in one single platform. We're going to close now the session for the morning. Is there anything else you wanted to ask? And if not, we can also take a few minutes at the beginning of the next session if you have any burning questions during lunch. Okay, so let's reconvene here at 3:30? 3:30? 3:30.